thank you everyone for coming to Partisan. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? I've already benefited from the Partisan space in this building. They kindly gave us the ground floor for rehearsal space for a project last week that we desperately needed. You quite often find in Manchester, I'm sure it's the same everywhere, that people are keen to include queer art and queer artists on their lineup. And I'm not saying that cynically because we are the best artists, but very often you don't get the infrastructure to support your own work, as I'm sure lots of you know. So thank you to Partisan for making our project happen recently. So the way that the panel's going to work is it's about queer politics and what role for art and culture. So it's quite a broad topic. So basically I'm going to start by talking about the kind of work that I do briefly, and also just to kind of give the talk a bit of a parameter about what the word queer means for me or how I use it. And then I'm going to invite each of the panellists to just introduce themselves, say who they are, what their work is, and then I'm going to ask them to do the same, to talk about the word queer and how they use it, whether they use it, and that'll be our starting off point. So and also the other panellist was going to be Khalil West, who's not here, but I'd like to urge everyone to go down to Contact Theatre and see the project that Khalil did there with Jamu, which is called I Am For You, Can Enjoy, and it's a mixture of portraits and video interview work with a group of amazing, fascinating individuals who all identify as queer black male sex workers. That's going to be on at the Contact for a few more weeks, I think, so go and check it out. It's really amazing piece. In the last couple of weeks, in the last couple of months actually, I've been just browsing around to see how people use the word queer, because the word only is how it's being used, and that's obviously changing over time. So in the past month I've seen queer used to mean a synonym for gay, a synonym for LGBTQ, to mean radical, to mean pansexual, to mean outside of the gay white mainstream with a different history and a different culture, and to mean heterosexual but sexually transgressive. So as a term, queer is, it's truly the umbrella term. And I think what we've seen probably in the last 10 years, this is a conversation I've had several times, is that feminism tends to hit a wall occasionally in public use where, as Bell Hooks said, if it comes to mean everything, it ends up meaning nothing. And that's been a real anxiety in kind of feminist discourse for the last 10 years. Whereas I see that queer quite often blossoms through its multiple uses, and I'm quite interested in how that happens and why that is. So the way that I use queer is more like, I'd say, a mindset. And what I mean by that is that queer to me is a way to critique the wider kind of heteronormative world, and also to critique the conservative gay world that tries to assimilate with it. So recently there have been a few examples of where I've thought that the queer mindset has been really illuminating and has really helped me to piece apart what's been happening in kind of public gay life. And I speak from the perspective of a white gay man looking at white gay male culture in these instances. One was a column that I saw this week, which is a white gay columnist talking about how it's high time that gay men left behind the culture of reading and shade. Now what he means by that is, let's all stop being bitches to each other and let's have some solidarity. But piecing apart that culture of reading and shade is not actually his culture to dispense with in the first place. So what you see there is cultural appropriation and then cultural disposal, and having a queer mindset lets you see that a perspective where you can read both of those levels. And I attribute that mindset to the other queer people that I know and to the writers that I read. And another one that struck me recently was you've probably seen that there's a group of queer activists who are objecting to the inclusion of the red arrows at London Pride, which basically means the RAF. So it's the militarisation of Pride, and the language that's been used against those activists has been things like, you're bullying us. So like the big institution that's Pride is saying to a small group of activists, you're bullying us. And the end line of the response was, if you don't like it, get your own Pride. Which obviously is like the ultimate assimilationist statement, which is that Pride is for certain people, and these activists identify as queer, and their perspective comes out of that as a way to critique Pride as kind of an institution. So these are the kinds of things that I'm interested in about as a queer person, and the artwork that I do, I guess, is curating. I curate events and produce events where I invite queer artists to come and have a stage and have access to performance space and that kind of thing. And I try to use that as a platform to give people a chance to try new work, to try old work for a new audience, and use other people's resources to kind of filter that down so that people can experiment with their work. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. I'm just going to now ask each of the panellists, Marilyn, Jess and Ray, just to introduce themselves and to talk a little bit about the work that they do, and if it's okay to talk about what the word queer means to you, each of you, whether you use it and how you use it. Okay, you want to go first?
Yeah, so I'm Marilyn Misandry. I'm a club kid, DJ and drag queen. I am responsible for this nonsense over here. My work basically features around, I'm very, very interested in using the iconography of American pop culture, especially from the 80s and 90s, in an anti-capitalist framework, and I'm interested in using it to comment on my relationship with gender and my positioning. To me, I use queer quite simply. I use queer to describe any act that deliberately and knowingly subverts, disrupts or attacks a heteronormative capitalist mainstream identity.
Right, thanks.
Great. My name is Jess Bradley. I'm an artist and an activist, and I work primarily. My artistic practice is involved in a group called Queer of the Unknown. We're a queer performance artist collective based here in Manchester, and we primarily are trans, disabled communists, and so our work kind of speaks to the intersections of disability, of queerness, and of being trans. And I guess for me, queer, again, similar to Marilyn's kind of definition, I think it actually describes behaviours and acts. I don't think that it is possible or not that it's not possible, but I don't think it's meaningful for me to define myself as queer. But things that I do could be queer, and like Greg was saying, I think queer is inherently kind of subversive, and it's not only looking at kind of the mainstream heterosexual cisgendered norms of society and critiquing those, but it's also critiquing assimilation of gay and lesbian communities. But actually, I think we should be kind of refocusing this and talking a lot about what we call the queer community, and actually thinking critically about people who use the term queer and how people are excluded with that and what necessarily that means for people. So maybe talking about the kind of the way in which queer language and queer ways of talking to each other is increasingly associated with the academy and the university, and how that can be kind of alienating for some people. Looking at kind of the norms of aesthetics within the queer community, and how actually a lot of queerness is based around a white masculine kind of aesthetic, which kind of alienates a lot of other people. So for me, I'd quite like to see a shift to focusing of queer kind of critiquing itself, and that's kind of what I'm interested in at the moment anyway.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm Ray, and I'm a writer and also an artist who does performances with both live art and drag. I do a lot of drag king stuff, and my drag is to do with satirising masculinity and taking on masculine stereotypes and interrogating them and parodying them and kind of like hoping to undercut them. One thing that I am quite interested in is being a queer drag king. So a lot of drag kings take on like what is ostensibly a straight guy, and they're like, oh hey, yeah, I'm the straight guy, and I'm interested in looking at gay men and queer men and queer masculine aesthetics and stereotypes, and working to make jokes out of those, essentially. So I do use the term queer to describe both myself and my actions, and I use it quite interchangeably with trans. Having said that, I agree with all of the definitions that have been given so far, and it would be quite hard to expand meaningfully upon them. But I would maybe add that, as well as being a set of actions and a mindset and a way of looking both outwards and inwards, I do think it's also about bodies and embodiment, and about how people who are self-defined as trans or queer, or who are perceived in that way, are othered, or have or are looked at in particular ways that we take on and we internalise, and that become shame and become so deeply held within our bodies that it's a part of us. So that's how I would maybe expand on what has been said.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, everyone. Can I just go back to you, Ray, to ask you about, because as a journalist, there's kind of quite a traditional format, even for kind of radical journalism and radical topics. There's a format of process and consumption and writing and distribution and everything. And obviously in your work you can bypass all of that. Is there a meeting point though between your writing and your art? Do you ever sit down and think, I can't write an essay about this, I need to cut to the chase sometimes? Or is there an overlap? Do they inform each other at all, I guess is what I'm asking.
I think it's kind of part of the same thing.
Yeah.
So I, up until this month, wrote for a magazine called Open Democracy, and I write a lot about social change and personal change, and how those two things come together. And that means I write a lot about queer issues and trans issues and gender politics generally, and intersectional politics. And I think that one thing I found is that because I'm part of an institution which goes onto like the internet and then people read it, sometimes I find that to be a total block in terms of what I can write and whether I can write anything at all. So I started making a lot more performance work because it felt more freeing, and because it felt like I could express things that like not even necessarily anybody would see. So it was much more of an open field.
So kind of liberating,
Yeah.
and even though the field is potentially smaller. That's so does your work as a drag king and a drag king satirist, what relationship does that have with lesbian performers and lesbian community with the drag, that kind of drag?
That's such a big
Does
question.
it have a relationship with it?
I guess the drag king scene, which is kind of on a high at the moment, I don't know how many people here are interested in drag kings, but
I find it's a lot more visible.
it suddenly seems to have taken off in the last maybe 5 years. And drag kings emerge out of lesbian communities, in particular mainstream lesbian communities, where there'll be like occasionally a drag king night, right? And then you're kind of lucky as a drag king if you are ever put on stage with a drag queen, because the platform's bigger, there's much more interest, many more people know that drag queens exist. And so I feel like lesbian communities have kind of been enclaves for drag kings to occasionally give us platforms. But I'd like to think that those subcultural boundaries have been kind of challenged more recently, and that there's more of an openness for there to be more of an intersection between lesbian putting on drag king performance and queer scenes putting on drag king performances that are maybe a bit more critical and a bit more politically engaged. I'm not sure if I'm answering this very well. I'd be interested to know what the other people think about that.
Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I know I can only really speak to my experience in Manchester's drag scene, which is quite unique. I'll give like a bit of background to it. Manchester is kind of very, very divided in a really interesting way. You have kind of like a very old school that's kind of nicknamed Bernard Manning drag, which is Bernard Manning drag. It is really like just kind of racist nonsense by someone called Tiffany Titties in like a bow feather who is vile. And then you've also kind of got like a really amazing underground, like there was a movement started which was literally a group of people started doing alternative drag and started using hashtag Manchester Queens. And Manchester Queens has kind of gone from just being Manchester Queens to becoming an all-encompassing form of drag. And what I found that's been really interesting with drag kings in Manchester is that there has been, this platform has now been extended. What I will say to it though is, in terms of drag queens being seen more, I would perhaps wouldn't disagree, but I would perhaps say I think a normative mainstream of drag queens are seen more. So the Bernard Manning of drag, and the drag that kind of acts in reverence to RuPaul is. But when you start to look at a lot more of the intricate subculture, so I would identify as a trans queen. Trans queening is still very, very frowned upon. I'm told quite frequently by drag queens that I'm not trans, and trans people that I'm not a drag queen. And I think what kind of happens with drag kings in terms of representation is, on the mainstream at least, the Bernard Manning of drag is never going to have a platform with it. But I think in terms of places like Manchester Queens, there is a lot of work to be done bringing the two together. And I find it quite interesting with Manchester Queens that Queens has gone from being a literal definition of drag queen to kind of becoming an all-encompassing body of anyone who doesn't perform or club in a normative way. So, for example, you'll see, if you go on the Instagram hashtag, you'll see really masculine rubber men or rubber gimps using Manchester Queens as a definer and calling that drag. And there's been some really interesting conversations in that regard, especially in Manchester, about where the boundaries of being a drag queen lie and stuff. And that's not to say that drag queen should become an all-encompassing term, because it shouldn't. But it's very interesting to me how the scene in Manchester is slowly kind of eroding away a lot of boundaries between, not even just drag king and drag queen, it's assimilating in people who, you might not necessarily associate with performing drag, but then arguing that actually, a muscle queen out in her rubbers for the night is doing the same kind of drag as anyone else.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think maybe, sorry, can I come in on that?
Yeah,
that's really interesting to hear, because I don't know much about Manchester, but I think what there is in London is, you get like the Bernard Manning drag in, and that's such a good term, you get that in like Soho, and then over in like Dalston you get kind of like pretty queens, so you get the kind of the Sink the Pink people who are mostly whites and very attractive and are very interested in like aesthetic, and the thing will be about coming on and being beautiful and fabulous and aesthetically pleasing, and most of those people are white cis men, and then I guess there is also a lot of like more queer drag queen stuff that doesn't get the same platform, and that's kind of where drag kings are also, I think. And I would like to see more of an overlap, because I think if what you're doing is politicising gender, or even if you're making a joke out of it, and even if that joke is still fabulous and aesthetically beautiful and pleasing, it's interesting to bring different approaches of that together and to be less kind of scene-based, separated.
So you both have spoken about performance and with the sort of terms around like kind of an obligation to the politics of what you're doing is like an obligation that informs your art, that it has a role to play, that there's certain stereotypes that you do feel like you need to address. Is that what nourishes the kind of work that you do, or do you ever feel like it's a boundary?
I'm not entirely sure, because I feel a lot of the times that rather than feeling that I have an obligation to parody the stereotypes, I find more power in acting out the stereotypes. So like one of my favourite pieces that I do is I have a piece called Requiem for Buffalo Bill, which is Silence of the Lambs, is one of my favourite films ever, and there's a really famous scene in Silence of the Lambs where Buffalo Bill, it's a really complicated definition and way to explain it. She's coded as a trans woman, and there is a lot of really quite nasty trans misogyny about it, but there's a scene in it where she is dancing in front of a mirror in a cloak with her genitals tucked between her to Goodbye Horses, and it's a really shocking, really quite transphobic scene. And I started finding that when I started just doing that as it was far more interesting to me than getting on and trying to challenge it. So I kind of found that enacting stereotypes and enacting it in a really kind of, when I do Buffalo Bill, it's sexy, it is beautiful, and I found was that and I found it kind of gave me a new angle on things, and I kind of find a lot of time in my work challenging stereotypes is boring almost. It almost feels like quite a neoliberal way of doing things, and to me there's something very, very interesting about saying actually these stereotypes exist, and rather than trying to go like, oh no, I'm more interested in reclaiming them. So I'm very interested, especially with Buffalo Bill, I'm very, very interested in a narrative that kind of says, obviously she's a serial killer who skins people, so she's not the greatest role model. But I think there's something for me as an artist, there was something very interesting about saying, well actually she is as a character in 90s American cinema. She is a trans woman who does assert her transness, and she does quite literally embody transness. So for me it was more about kind of finding stereotypes and going, well actually what can I do with them to make them interesting.
Well, even that is a kind of process of queering, because you're probably too young to remember this, Marilyn, but when Silence of the Lambs came out, the popular kickback was and I don't think they even used the term transphobia at the time. They talked about it as a homophobic film. People said this film will cost people's lives. And actually, secretly, lots of queer people were like, oh my God, Jodie Foster and her compatriot, and that whole, the queer dance, as I always think of it.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that generationally that's become something that's, right, not for reclamation, but the fact that you can own that performance is actually really quite illuminating. Can I come back to what you were saying earlier, Jess, about the academisation of queer and the ability, and actually I guess the responsibility of queer and queer community to assess that term and to not to police it, but to take responsibility for it, I guess. Can you talk a little bit more about that and it maybe in terms of your work?
Yeah, sure. I think that there's kind of this ongoing academisation of the term queer, and I think it's probably because a lot of people in universities, academics, have kind of looked to queer lives which are interesting and valuable, and seen that there's a lot of explanatory power in the way that we live our lives and the way that we reclaim spaces, the way that we subvert the kind of norms of society, and as a result people have kind of used queers almost, and I'm not saying that the people actually doing this writing aren't queer themselves, often most of them are, but there's kind of been this kind of siphoning off of this kind of these acts, explaining them and then legitimizing them, and that's had a lot of and that's been used, you know, now because I'm a PhD student, so very much part of this problem. You see people who, you know, are the straightest, most cis people in the world using queer theory and queer studies to kind of explain their work, because it is a useful set of theories. But for me, that kind of divorces and doesn't pay necessary homage to where that kind of stuff has gone. And it's similar to how I see kind of white queer communities using the term intersectionality without paying homage to black feminism and where that's come from. There's this process of kind of being like, oh, this is useful for us, we'll kind of take it and use it. One of the things that I've found within my practice in Manchester, you can kind of see this with a lot of queer art, is that actually queerness and especially transness is become very interesting for people, and so you get situations like Eddie Redmayne, a cis man playing a trans woman in a film. So people who aren't trans and who aren't queer kind of want to engage with our material, but end up making cultural products which don't actually tell our real life stories and kind of tell their idea of what our stories are. So there's been a situation in Manchester recently whereby a big art gallery in Manchester has invited somebody to do a piece which they're calling an artistic ethnography of the transmasculine community, where this person is a cisgender woman who is taking testosterone in order to research the trans community, and which is obviously the worst idea in the world, and this person needs to insert themselves into the bin as quickly as possible. But again, it's this kind of, people wanted to do, the gallery wanted to pay someone to do trans art, so they got a cis person to do it, which, you know, is problematic, and I'm sure that this person obviously will have some, you know, I'm not saying that this person doesn't have anything interesting to say about embodiment, and coming from that perspective, but it's not necessarily trans art, it's something else. And whilst trans artists are living in the city and being massively underfunded for the work that they're doing, not funded, not being given spaces in galleries or in you know, the official spaces of Manchester, it kind of feels like a kick in the teeth. So a lot of our work has kind of been going around trying to like kind of subvert these kind of narratives and kind of insert our own stories that don't necessarily fit the idea of what cis people think that our transness, how our transness should be read.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. Thanks, Jess. We actually. I'm sorry. Come on. Yeah, please go on.
Say one of the themes of my year so far has been being contacted by straight cis journalists who write for mainstream publications, and them being like, hey, so 2016 is the year of gender fluidity, and and we've heard that you're a gender fluid person, so maybe I could ask you some questions, so that I can write up your opinions in my piece without crediting you, and without offering you any money. And I've started to be like, maybe I should have a consultancy fee for. But it's exactly what you're saying. Like, you know, people have decided that it's sexy now to be trans if you're like a particular kind of trans, and like, you know, if you're like white and trans mask like me, and then they're like, well, let's use that because people suddenly like for this year want to read about it, and then next year it will be something different, and nothing will have actually changed for the communities to whom the articles like supposedly pertain. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
So I was going to say it's interesting because I think going back to the conversation about trans artists with the gallery spaces and the fact that there aren't those gallery spaces. What I found really interesting is in my work, because I consider my club kidding drag queen my art, because it is. And what I found really interesting is I've never worked in gallery spaces before. And what I found, first of all, because when I first started, there wasn't any desire to, but what I found more and more now is that I almost relish in taking my art into very, very normative cis spaces and kind of being like, trans in your fucking face! Quite literally sometimes. Somebody nearly got slapped last time I was performing. I just got really into it. But I've always kind of so I will perform in clubs and stuff, but I really relish kind of taking really, really aggressively political trans pieces and then doing them in like a really kind of dingy cis gay male bar. So like Cruise, does everyone know Cruise 101 in Manchester? It is not a nice place. It's like the gay Phoenix nights, but it's kind of fucking it is. But it's a really interesting space to do trans art in because it is not a space that people expect to have it in. So you kind of have such freedom with it in that way. And I think it's really interesting to me, like obviously what happened at home. Sorry, are we allowed to say the gallery?
Yeah, well, we have
sorry.
now.
I'm sorry.
I'm going to speak.
I didn't mean to. Sorry, the gallery redacted. When they did it, so what was interesting to me was that it was more conservative spaces like this were the ones that were trying to seek out cis people to tell the art, whereas more normative spaces already kind of had it a bit without realising, and it kind of led me to wonder a bit about whether there should be a kind of reassessment about how we view galleries and other spaces for our art.
But also, go on, Jess.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to dive in. Yeah, because it's one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, actually, and about how actually, like, this kind of art that's produced in outside of gallery spaces is, like, without being like, yes, I am one of these producers, but, you know, whatever, it is ahead of the curve, objectively, and we a couple of years ago did a show as part of a gallery at a theatre which is well known in Manchester for doing queer theatre. And last year we put in a bid to kind of do something around trans, about toilets and access to toilets from a trans and disability perspective. We did this. We put a bid in at a Manchester theatre and elsewhere. And people told us, you know, this isn't really that relevant politically at the moment, so we're not going to really give you the thing. And then obviously now, all of this stuff with North Carolina and all the stuff in the United States has meant that I'm sure if we put this bid in again, they would snap it up. But now we're like, oh well, now it's kind of we've done that stage of our art. We've processed our feelings about this. I don't think we can go back to that. So actually, it is one of those things where actually, like, often the institutions that pay and fund for queer artists often feel like they're at the cutting edge kind of stuff, but actually they are kind of compared to other artistic institutions, they are, but that kind of cutting edge is still kind of blunt compared to where actually trans and queer artists really are.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you say, it's like a kind of chronic misunderstanding, and it won't work, like that kind of top-down institutional art just won't work for queer communities. And just going back to the artist who was a South American artist who wanted to work with trans community in Manchester, because of the work that I do, which is always described as LGBT, that request to meet the trans community of Manchester came to me. It came to several people, but it came to me. And I know for a fact that if I never ever put trans people into my events, into my work, no one would question it. But when it's in the other direction and they want access to trans people, they think, oh, this person might know. Now that's like a fundamental a problem, and my response to the artist was actually, you should send a Brazilian trans artist to Manchester. That's what you should do with that money. I'm just going to go back to something else that you said, Jess, that was interesting, which is about queer not being a thing that you are, but rather a thing that you do. And this is a very long-running critical discourse really around the queer moment, I think is what Jonathan Sinfield calls it, which is, he kind of pinpoints it to the Oscar Wilde thing, which is the mass publicisation of gay life practically overnight. And at that moment, gay stopped being a thing that you did and became a thing that you are. And I think actually what queer life is suggesting is that circle is moving back around. It also reminds me of what Bell Hooks spoke about, which is that she's moving away from that notion of a feminist and back into feminism as a thing that you do, which will erase that kind of identity politics of you can be a feminist, you can put it on like a t-shirt instead of the work that you do. Do you think that's like a positive thing? Do you see that those two things might dovetail at all? Or
I'm very conflicted about it, I have to say.
Yeah.
I think that I've watched people, a growing number of people talking about being post-queer, and that the idea is that queerness has become about a kind of assigned female at birth, masculine aesthetic, one that is white, one that is thin, that is like compulsory polyamorous and all this kind of stuff, at the same time kind of divorced from class politics, and again kind of this kind of problem of the over academization of language, the kind of the policing of who gets to be in that community and who doesn't, that kind of stuff. And I think all of those issues are stuff that I think are very real issues with the queer community, but I'm not sure about post-queer as an identity and kind of how that fits. I do think it's better to think of queer as a thing that you do, and therefore it becomes something that makes all of your actions accountable and open to being accountable. But in terms of this kind of move towards post-queer and a reclaiming of gay or lesbian and these kind of things, I think it's coming from a very like anti-intellectual perspective, and something that, you know, for people who are involved in the student movement, like a few years back when the students were all occupying places, we were all talking about how this would lead to a wave of anti-intellectualism, and that this is now what we're having, and I kind of see this post-queer bit as part of that. But again, often it's the same people who were, you know, in those buildings talking about how anti-intellectualism is a problem, and now doing this kind of post-queerness. So for me, I'm very kind of conflicted because I have problems with the term queer and how it's mobilised, but I also have a lot of love for it, and I think that a lot of the people who are kind of moving away from queer come from like a kind of feeling of disappointment. Like when I first found queer, I thought, oh God, this is the revolution. Like this like explains so much and it's really important, and like I want to apply this to myself, and I've become disappointed by it. But that's kind of the nature of living under capitalism. So yeah, it's hard, and I think part of being queer is actually being ambivalent to things in general, and I think probably that's where I'm at right now.
I mean, I can relate a lot to that in various ways, because I remember that first discovery of queer as a kind of a way to embrace sexual identity and not to have to throw the baby out with the bathwater because gay culture was so oppressive and wouldn't address things that I've experienced, like gender dysphoria and just, you know, the sexual obsession of gay culture and how hypersexualized it is. And queer culture addressed a lot of that, but it can't keep addressing it because it's so fluid, and you probably find this, that in queer culture, like sexual obsession moves to the fore quite repeatedly, and it can be quite suffocating, and that to me is just a repetition of what went wrong with gay culture in lots of ways. I'm going to move the topic on to talk about gentrification and independent spaces and how that impacts on queer art and queer artists. We'll start with you, Ray, if that's okay, because you're from London, and it's happening fairly rapidly down there, the process of gentrification. I don't know if people are aware that of Johnny Woo and Scotty, who are those two queer artists, both of whom kind of quite publicly said, like, I'm throwing my lot in with London now, I'm moving out to Southend and Margate, and who were responsible directly and indirectly for a lot of the rapid changes in various neighbourhoods in East London and the origins of some of the queer scene out there, and have now been priced out, or however you want the narrative to be framed around that. And we were talking, Jess and I were talking just before the panel about how as gay people, queer people are often, I guess, blamed for gentrification, which is actually down to a series of quite high-level civic decisions and municipal decisions, but the way that we change neighbourhoods, the way that we characterise neighbourhoods, which ultimately then prices us out, and the importance of being able to have a venue to make mistakes in that doesn't cost you loads of money. Where do you think London is at? Where are you at with all of that?
I'm in a process of having to move south out of London because I can't afford to live there. That's kind of where I'm at. One of the first things that the very first thing that I thought when I arrived today is, like, look at this place. There's so much space here. There's 4 floors of space of this building that you guys have been able to take over as a collective and set up to use for nearly, how long have you got it for? Like 6 months? 3 months, okay, for some time. Yeah. And this doesn't exist in London. And I don't know whether perhaps it used to, but certainly there is not the space for a big venue like this that would be either affordable or squattable because of the changes in laws around squatting. So when I first came out, there were still gay places, I guess, in Soho, and that's where I started experiencing gayness, queerness. Now that's no longer the case, really. There's like maybe a few posh bars for gay men still there. And I remember there being, since then, a whole bunch of really cool, rad, queer art spaces that were set up in London, and none of them really exist anymore because of gentrification. And it's just like everyone's pushed down. A lot of people now live in the south, so we have a place quite near me in Bermondsey called DIY Space for London, and that's the main queer art space at the moment, and it's really cool, and they put on a load of gigs there, a load of really cool bands go, but it's really expensive too. They pay a lot in rent, and I think it's unsustainable as a model. Kate was just telling me that the Common House, which is the other main space, which is in Bethnal Green, is maybe having trouble and is in a process of moving, so it's really bad, essentially. But as you say, it's not fault of queer people. I'm thinking about where I live, which is in a place called Brockley, next to Peckham. I don't know who knows London, but that's where I live. And a whole bunch of queers I know also live around that sort of area. I don't think that anybody is going to move to Brockley because we're there, because we're all really poor, and I don't think that they think we're like the wave of artists. I think we're like the wave of people who can't afford to live. So I don't know. I feel like if there are people saying it's those queers causing gentrification, then I don't think they know what it's like. I see you've got Sarah Shulman on a piece of paper. I was going to say, I guess I remember reading in something that she'd written about how New York very quickly gentrified after HIV/AIDS in the 80s, because when people died, landlords were able to put up the rent on their apartments. But I'm not sure that it would be right to extrapolate from that.
No, I mean, it seems like that gay and queer people will get blamed for gentrification one way or the other, whether you open the gym or you die, basically. But I mean, it's a complicated model. I don't know if anyone saw the Penny Arcade show on Thursday night at Contact, and she comes out of that same New York group of artists and thinkers that includes Sarah Shulman. And she spoke about, and Sarah Shulman speaks about, that gentrification is not just the homogenisation and the suburbanisation of cities, it's also the homogenisation of ideas. So all of the institutions in those places also gentrify, whether that's the art academy or the bar or whatever. And it's hard to go back from that, because you can't backdate diversification in a neighbourhood that no one can afford to live in, and just what the knock-on effects of that are. And Penny Arcade's show is brilliant. It's like a 45-minute diatribe with music about what's being lost. And I know that Jess, you're urban geographer, is that right?
Yeah.
Does gentrification come into the work that you do?
Quite often, yeah. My work, my kind of academic work looks at how the actual decisions that are made within cities and kind of why it is cities are planned the way that they are, why it is there's no creativity within city planning. I think I've got it down that the answer is capitalism.
It's going to be a short.
Yeah. Basically, I have to stretch that out to 80,000 words. But I guess it is one of those things, and I think that in Manchester, certainly the kind of gay quarter has become a part of Manchester's kind of marketable identity as a city. And same with other areas, like Chinatown. It's kind of been engaged with and on this way that we will demarcate it and sanitize it to sell it to other people, and obviously queer people lose out when that happens. But I guess I'd quite like to return to this idea, because I think it's interesting, this idea of queer people as kind of agents of gentrification, because there is a certain amount of truth that when poor queer people move into an area and start kind of producing cultural products or whatever, then when that gets picked up by other people, it looks like we've been involved in creating an interesting and lively place to be. That's because we are involved in creating interesting and lively places to be. I don't necessarily think that's a reason to not do that, but it's a reason to kind of to actually repoliticize our work and really make sure that we stick around to defend the places that we're in from gentrification. So but I think there's a certain amount of homophobia or queerphobia in this idea that we kind of do this as well, because we've always kind of been associated with something that's excessive. So we're always being we are kind of a neoliberal wet dream of people who are so consumer based and all this kind of stuff, whereas actually that's not really the reality of our lives. So it's kind of very hard to disentangle actually what is what is actually happening on the ground, and what is the kind of narrative that city planners are doing, what is the narrative of the media, what is the narrative of other people, and kind of disentangle that. And it's really difficult and painful, and it makes it really hard to kind of produce art in spaces, which is why I think a lot of people just end up either producing the art or doing the activism and kind of trying to avoid this merge of the two.
I mean, I think there's definitely a wave in which like really poor people who may or may not be queer are in an area, move to an area. Some of those people are artists, because some poor people are artists. And then because there are queer people, there are then richer LGBT people who have jobs and who then move to that area. And like, I don't really want to blame gay people either, but it seems like that's more of a sort of more, there's more steps in the process between like poor queer people over here, poor people of colour, poor working class people, and then like property developers over here. Also, what you just said was making me think about. I was having a conversation with my housemate last week, and we were like, "Well, it doesn't seem like we go out much anymore. Is it just that we're like old? Are we getting old now? Is it is it like 30 happening, or?" And then we came to the conclusion that it's actually that we are really poor, and everybody we know is struggling with mental health problems, and people are like, if they have jobs, they're working weekends, and so everyone is struggling, and so we have communities of support sometimes, hopefully, that are problematic and that need to be interrogated and changed, but we have those communities, and that's what we create. I don't know where I'm going with that, but it's related in some way.
It's an interesting point because, and also it's a conversation that I've had a lot in the last 6 months, is that if I run out of money, which is frequent, like I work every day, which also curtails the amount of time that you can have contact with people, but run out of money frequently. And actually the ways that we get together with the rest of the community, if I run out of money, it can be quite a long time before I have contact with the community, and that shouldn't really be the case, and I'm not sure how that's crept up on me.
I know, I've definitely kind of, because I don't actually live in Manchester anymore. I live in like quite a rural area of Derbyshire, and I am a poor starving artist, and I'm on benefits. I'm on universal credit, which is like the worst system that's ever been created. I managed to trigger an internal investigation into how badly my feelings, that's divulging. And what I found really interesting is how quickly community is linked to me having the money to be into that community. So it's a similar thing of, if I go out for the weekend with friends, it's suddenly, oh my god, Marilyn, we haven't seen you in ages, oh we love you, it's great. And then there maybe will be 3 or 4 weeks before I can come out again, when that's not really the case. And it's really, and it's not done consciously. I think the other thing that I wanted to talk about was kind of like, because I know we're talking about gentrified gay spaces, one of the things that I found really interesting in relation to my work that I do is how a lot of my work has kind of, not without even realising, it's become part of movements that have formed around gentrified spaces. So we talked about Canal Street and the gay quarter a lot, and Canal Street is generally a terrible place, full of regret, misery and steps music. It is like but what's been really interesting to me is how even within this absolute shithole of a nightmare, there have been some really interesting radical scenes formed from it. So like going back to Manchester Queens is explicitly of the village, and it's been really interesting that I've had a lot of conversations about how gentrification and queerness, and less so about the geographical and economical gentrification, more about how there's almost a sense of cultural gentrification of queerness, even amongst radical spaces, and how it's been really interesting that there's almost been a kind of inadvertent reclamation of spaces that are very normatively queer, and it's kind of, it interests me how it's, because the other side to it is Canal Street is cheap. There are places that do 99p drinks, and if that's your, and it's that. It's been a really interesting thing to look at how, in a lot of ways, there's almost been an inadvertent reclamation of the culture of Canal Street by people with radical politics, but almost completely inadvertently, perhaps as a result of gentrification. Which isn't to say that I think gentrification is good, and it should, we should try and find a middle ground between we can't live anywhere, but we can go out and that. But I think it's interesting to kind of look at how it's almost pushing us into taking back these spaces. But then again, no one is obliged to take back Canal Street, because...
I like that as a slogan, though. Take back Canal Street. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, something that you said made me quite interested, and I think that kind of this idea of like the politics of taking back Canal Street and how like it's kind of happened by accident, and it probably had to happen by accident because when we look at Canal Street, we probably look at it and probably think, oh God, that's like beyond saving. And I kind of feel like we often have this idea that we kind of have to be pure with our radicalism, like we have to be like pure revolutionaries, and if something that happens with a project that we're engaged with, which in some way is appropriated by capitalism or whatever, then therefore it's like completely unsavable and not worth it. We have to cut it off and start something completely new. So I think we often go through these kind of fads of discovering something new, feel like it's radical and relevant, and then kind of being like, okay, no, we're going to drop this because now it has become capitalist, as if like capitalism just isn't everywhere infusing everything that we do. But the kind of idea that like because capitalism is everywhere and infusing everything that we do, that everything is already failed from the get-go. So we need to kind of move beyond that kind of thinking. And I think with some of the stuff that we were saying about queer and how people are moving away from queer or like interrogating queer, that actually a lot of that, I think that there's a lot of stuff worth saving about queer and all of this stuff. And I think that and even the like spaces like seeing queer people as agents of gentrification or whatever, I think it's all part of actually we need to kind of almost engage with the kind of glass half full perspective on these kind of processes sometimes, in order to kind of move on and actually do the things of life and like rebuild communities.
Yeah, I mean that
people have been doing it with feminism for however long I've been aware of it. Being like, should we still be feminists? Should we just should we just give up on that? And I've always thought that we shouldn't give up on it. And similarly, I think I would not want to give up on queer, but maybe it's okay for me. But yeah, I kind of agree that like because everything is problematic all the time anyway, and because you can't, or what you can do is push to make it better rather than like being like, oh, we've ruined that. Let's like start over here and repeat all the same problems again. I was thinking also about the idea of not letting them gentrify you out, and obviously that's kind of easier said than done in many ways, because putting on any kind of like resistance to that requires you not to already be dealing with the problems that being pushed out of that space has made you have to deal with. But there has been quite a good campaign in London around saving the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, which is London's oldest queer cabaret venue, and not a perfect space, but one that's been under threat of redevelopment. Some developers have essentially bought it, and they were going to turn it into a gay male wine bar venue. So it's all been repainted, and there's this space which pretty much anyone who's been on the queer cabaret scene in London has performed in at some time or another, because it's open and you can just go and perform there. And there are lots of nights which take on beginner artists and give them a space to be. So there's been a really active campaign pushing back against this, and even though the developers have bought it, they've managed to get it listed as a venue, so they can't turn it into flats. And so there is a possibility, I think, for campaigns which push back against gentrification, particularly when it comes to queer art spaces. At the same time, you need the power and the resources and the capacity to be part of those campaigns and to keep going with them, because obviously developers have a lot more money and power.
It's interesting. I mean, we should talk about ways to resist, really, and that's a nice kind of segue into it, because in the last year I've been trying to think of different strategies really because gentrification in Manchester is, it's a peculiar system that's quite different to London, and it's almost like stealth in a way. But for queer people and performers, it comes down to quite often that the default instinct is to be a bit quiet about it, is to not draw attention to what's happening in case it gets co-opted and all of that. And I don't think that's a good strategy. So we were having a conversation about how do you celebrate and how do you become successful? I mean, how do you earn a living from doing what you want to do if you've constantly got the fear that it will be co-opted or that it will be taken from you. So one of the jobs that I do is to help manage the fundraising for Islington Mill, which is an independent arts venue in Salford, which is 4 floors of an old mill building that's run as an independent arts venue for 20 years. There's been 1,700 artists from around the world through their doors in the last 20 years, and it's proved itself to be a sustainable, like kind of ecological almost model of what an art space can be. And they've got a complicated relationship with developers because the developers want to use their institution as a way to characterise an artistic neighbourhood without actually doing anything to help the mill. They haven't supported any of the artists there, but actually it's been almost validated by £1 million Arts Council fund and a big chunk more from Salford City Council, which is kind of a way of saying we respect this model and it works, but we have to match fund that in order for it to be released. So this is the big drive, and that's a conversation really about gentrification, because they want all of the backdrop of what is a cool artistic neighbourhood without any of the support. So that's an ongoing conversation. And the other work that I've just started doing is running Superbia, which is we're not allowed to call it a fringe festival. It's the year-round calendar of cultural events that is funded.
Which is not as catchy, really.
No, it doesn't even fit on one line.
That's right, certainly reveal the gallery, you're allowed to call it a fringe festival.
Yeah, I'm allowed to call it fringe festival, which is run by Manchester Pride. So one of the things that I'm interested in is in the gentrification of Pride, and I used that example before about like the militarisation of Pride and all of those things. So when I went to speak to the people at Pride, I said, if you're going to have a fringe festival, it has to be contrary to the main festival. It has to be able to have difficult conversations. And to their credit, they said, yeah, that's absolutely fine. So what we're looking at putting together over the big weekend is a space that's the complete opposite to the festival. So it will be a dry space, it will be a daytime space, it will be for families, it will be for all of the people who basically are shut out of the village when the fences go up. And so that's my way of A, making a living, and B, trying to contribute to something that is opposite to the gentrification of Pride, and to make those people have that conversation with me. Now also that's a fortunate position for me to be in, to be able to do that, and there's not a lot of positions like that. But these are some of the ways that I'm thinking about that we can resist and get paid. And all of those things. Has anybody got anything to talk about?
I kind of wanted to go back a little bit to what we were saying about the RV2 of it being listed. So I know listing is often used as resistance against gentrification, and it almost worries me, because it almost worries me that in doing that we're creating a dynamic of queer spaces that are worthy and queer spaces that are unworthy. And I think what worries me is that, for example, I know I was just slagging off Cruise 101, but I love it a lot. But what I think is interesting to me is that there are people who will have the kind of the emotional attachment to queer spaces like Cruise 101 as they would to the RVT, and they would have the kind of the familial attachment to Cruise. And what worries me when we talk about buildings that are listed and stuff is it almost feels like we're creating we're almost creating like a binary of good queer spaces and bad queer spaces. Yeah, and I think in the short term, listing buildings is a really good tool of resistance. I think there needs to be some kind of conversation about, well, actually, does it privilege certain spaces over others? It's interesting as well when we're talking about Pride, because I remember years and years ago, the way I got into the queer movement and everything was through Pride as a protest years and years ago, which was at ACE, and should come back at some point, I think. But I can remember being really kind of like, that would be my first exposure to the gay scene, and that kind of as well being like almost the first example of quite literal gentrification. Like the way that Manchester Pride rings itself off is like it's almost it's kind of almost cartoonish in how literal it is in its definition. Yeah. And I almost think that even stuff like the Fringe Festival, I almost think that the only way that we'll ever get over like Pride as it is now being gentrified is kind of accepting that actually we have Pride that exists now as a capitalist institution, where it is a music festival for essentially for cis gay men and straight women to come and party, and we have Pride as a movement. And I think it kind of talks to how we were talking about how space is gentrified, but it's harder to gentrify movement. And I think it almost goes back to this idea of queer being something that we do rather than what we be. And I think what kind of happens with Pride is we are facing a divide of there is the Pride that is the literal Pride, which is the horrible ring-fenced Canal Street booze fest, and then there is the Pride that is enacted, which is which is the existence of queerness. And I think it almost kind of comes back to talking about gentrification in terms of the personal versus the literal. And I'm confusing myself now, so I'm going to...
No, it's... Were you going to jump in? Sorry,
yeah, I agree. So obviously there's been like a whole bunch of anti-pride prides over time, and one of the ones that is running in London at the moment is a thing called Queer Picnic, which is run by some queer and trans people of colour, artists and activists. And the first time that it was put on was last year, and it was just my friend Krishna who put up a Facebook page and was like, hey, come to the park. And 1,000 people came, and it was really, really amazing. And there was a huge amount of care given to how the space was structured and to who was being represented there. And I think by all accounts it was reasonably successful. I'm sure there will be some critiques, but I thought it was good. I agree that I think that we need to let go of Pride, like Pride TM, the official Pride. I feel like I read some stat that they spend something like, I don't know if this can possibly be right, but something like £26,000 on security in London, or 2,600, or whatever the decimal place is. There are thousands of pounds that Pride in London, the official corporation, spend on having police and fencing and securitising the space. And given that it was originally an anti-police riot, that is fucked up. And so I also think let go of it and do something else and push back against it through action and through being part of a movement.
But it's like Marilyn said, it's harder to gentrify a movement, and also like I find that Pride's quite anonymising at the point where you really want to see the community.
Yeah, definitely.
You literally can't see it. I mean, I lived next to the village for 6 years, and my morning routine of sitting in the park and watching the Chinese pensioners who live on Canal Street do their Tai Chi. That's my Canal Street, and I'm a gay person, and that should be my neighbourhood. And then to have that just like literally fenced off overnight, it's actually quite painful.
It's almost a violent experience I found with Pride. Like I go to Pride each year because I like it and it's a fun experience, but there is always some kind of thing quite violent in how much your identity is stripped up. And I can remember as well, I can be like, it's the only time that I've ever felt uncomfortable being in drag in public is at Pride, which because of the fact that drag is something that sets you out so much. And I think because Pride is so anonymised, like you said, you instantly become a focus for a lot of stuff. And what I kind of find more and more so is that when I'm doing drag at Pride, it's less about doing drag for myself, and it almost feels like I'm doing drag purely for consumption as another. And it's a weird experience. Plus as well, it's like a toxic atmosphere of people with absolutely no boundaries and lots and lots of alcohol. Like I've kind of given up on not having my arse felt up at Pride. Like the first 2 years I tried to kick off about it. Now I just wear 2 pairs of underwear and hope for the best.
I think with Pride, I think it's useful to look at where its roots have come from and kind of who it's for. And obviously Pride as a thing comes from an anti-police riot and by trans people of colour and by street kids, and that's exactly who are being excluded from Manchester Pride when they put up the fences. It's the homeless kids who sleep on Canal Street who find that a safer place for them as queer homeless people who are excluded from that space. So it's exactly antithetical to that kind of original vision. I think there is useful ways of kind of looking back to history and kind of subverting these kind of norms and using the space. So a few years ago, I saw a video of some drag queens, hashtag Manchester Queens, they were, who had sailed into Pride on a canal boat because they don't put they didn't put the fence up on the canal because they just didn't think that this was
the canal goes straight through the village.
Yeah.
For those who don't know.
So they had these queens going in like, hello, we're here, we broke through your fence. But like, there's an argument to say, let's just tear down the fucking fence. Like, I mean, yeah, I would be there for that. But in the local history of Manchester, which I've kind of researched because I do a kind of a radical history tour of Canal Street. If anyone's interested, I will do one for you at some point.
Share that on the page for this event. So
yeah.
Can see. That would be great.
And what Manchester Pride originally started off as was a kind of gay Olympics in the car park. And so what we want to do, one of the organisations I work for is called Action for Trans Health, which is a transgender healthcare campaign, which is a one firmly within a kind of anti-capitalist paradigm. We want to do exactly that. So we want to go into one of the car parks that is kind of around Canal Street, turf it, and instead of having cars there, we're going to have gay Olympics. So we're going to have handbag tossing and the three-legged mints and all of this kind of complete nonsense. And hopefully you will come and give us loads of money for activism and all that kind of stuff. Not me personally. So we kind of want to kind of revisit some of the stuff that we've done in the past when actually these movements were less co-opted, and then kind of look to what's been done before, because actually a lot of the stuff that has been done before is really valuable, and we don't necessarily have to kind of put ourselves under the pressure of constantly producing new things when actually stuff that happened 20 years ago is actually really cool and relevant now.
Yeah, there's a thing about all of those alternative queer resistance histories that don't get recorded and don't get written, and so we're like continuously having the same conversations.
I think as well that kind of almost speaks to, I think we talked about how like queer is sometimes aestheticised as a very certain thing, and I think what's interesting with some of the origins of Manchester Pride is how I look at it sometimes in my work, but I've talked a lot about how northern queerness is quite erased and stuff. And one of the first events at Pride was a bring and buy sale outside a pub on some table, which is such a northern thing to do, and it often feels like there's a very specific kind of queer resistance in the north. So the bring and buy sale, I think it was Tracy from New York, who did it, and it was a bring and buy sale with the funds going to an AIDS charity. And I think what kind of happens is the more that queer kind of gets aestheticised into one kind of thing, we kind of forget that there are alternate models of resistance to it, and I think it does talk to how queer models of resistance are quite overlooked. And I think it's the same kind of issue of any kind of activism, that unfortunately a bring and buy sale for an AIDS charity isn't going to have the same kind of, it's not as sexy as people like rioting and kicking off and stuff, but it's just as vital. And I think what kind of happens, especially in terms of when we look at northern queerness, is because there is something very specific. Like, I don't like cozy is such a shit word for it, because it's not cozy. It's angry and beautiful. There's something very kind of warm and loving about northern queer resistance, and I think it kind of gets overlooked as being a little bit kind of woolly and a bit cute, when in fact it's not. It's just a very different way of doing it. And I think again it speaks to gentrification, because gentrification is fucking everywhere, as I'm realising throughout this.
We went to a anti-Pride event that Club Brenda put on years and years ago at the Star and Garter that coincided with the actual Pride weekend. And David Hoyle was at the door snipping off the wristbands that people had bought for Pride. That was like such a brilliant moment for me. So I think we're going to kind of move to, if anybody wants to ask us questions, I think that'll be the next stage that we'll go to. Anything about queer art, gentrification, anything about any of the work that anybody on the panel does. Any questions at all, please feel free to fire them out. Yes.
Marilyn, you mentioned something about, I can't remember how you worded it, but it was something about challenging stereotypes is a neoliberal act.
Yeah.
I just wanted to develop on it a little bit more.
So for me, what it came down to was before I kind of go into my explanation of this, I am a trans feminine person, and I reclaim the word tranny as someone who explains trans misogyny. That's kind of quite crucial to explaining it. I kind of operate under one of my mottos in my art is I'm not a good tranny. Came up with like a concept of a friend of good trannies and bad tranny. I call myself I'm a bad tranny. And one of my arguments is that I saw a lot of arguments against trans misogyny kind of going, like, no, we're not like these bad trannies. We're not like these bad trannies who are doing like this, and the other thing. And I was kind of going, well, actually, yeah, I am. I do enjoy it. And so to me, it almost felt like there kind of seemed to be an entire movement, an entire gay scene and trans scene that was kind of very much based on good as you. We're just born this way, and we're going to do that by absolutely disparaging all these kind of stereotypes. Whereas to me, it was kind of going, well, actually, there's a lot of power in these stereotypes. So I've always said that like I'm very interested in my work in looking at kind of monstrous femininity, and then as an extension, monstrous trans femininity. And what I kind of found was that I wasn't getting as much power as a trans person from the idea of the good tranny. I was getting the idea from the bad tranny. I was getting it from from kind of like an aesthetic, and then there was almost kind of like an aesthetic that went with it. So to me, it kind of, when I say challenging stereotypes, to me is a neoliberal act. It's a neoliberal act in that it depends on the idea that the stereotype itself needs to be challenged. It depends on the idea that we have to fit into a society by denouncing why they dislike us, rather than going, well, you dislike us because of this, and fuck you, because this is us. It is a deliberately provocative statement, but I quite like making deliberately provocative statements.
I think also what you mentioned, the whole born this way, like that whole thing is so. I mean, that's a neoliberal thing as well, but also it contains so much hate in it, which is that we have to excuse it as a condition, which bypasses the fact that if you chose to love someone of the same or multiple genders, that as a thing in itself is fine. We don't have to excuse it as a condition of ourselves. It's fine as it is. So it speaks to that kind of complicated thing. Were you going to say something?
I was just going to agree.
I was
agreeing. Kind of vocally agreeing. Yeah, I think there's part of this kind of neoliberalizing kind of imperative to do this. You see it everywhere. Like it's kind of. I was speaking at an event which was called Out at Work, which was put on. I was asked to do a Trans 101 session. They were paying me, so that was why I was there. Like the whole narrative was about being like proud of who we are in the workplace, and kind of performing our best queer selves. Like be like trans people, queer people, we're just as good workers as everyone else. So therefore, but that's what this whole stereotype comes down to. And like I've recently had to consider getting a proper job, which is awful, because I'm about to go into my field work in a planning consultancy. And they've basically turned around and said, you kind of need to look normal to work for us, which is, kind of expected. But that's where it kind of starts. It's all this kind of stuff around challenging stereotypes, and we're not all mincing faggots and all this kind of stuff is about proving that we can work just as well as straight people. And I'm a proud mincing faggot, and I am really not a good person to employ. I will take all of my shits on company time.
Resist.
Yeah, that's my... No, I do other things besides that as resistance. It's a good place to start.
Shit-based resistance is it's really overlooked. I feel like there are... Sorry, can I... I don't know if there needs really to be any more answer to that question. So, I feel like there's lots of interesting things you can do with stereotypes. Drag king stuff works on the basis of stereotypes because masculinity is so perceived as the norm that even to come on stage and be a recognisable figure that people are going to respond to requires tapping into something like the most recognisable one is Elvis, right? Like that's like the root of drag king stuff is this, you know, flamboyant, hyper-masculine guy ripping off black culture. And so you have like firemen and you have like the punk, or you have like one thing I do is called Toms of Finland, and it's me and someone I work with a lot being 80s gay leather clones, and those are stereotypes, and it works that we go. I think it works. Obviously, I would say that it's my work, but hopefully it works on the basis that when we come onto stage wearing like these leathers and the hats and the vests and the, you know, the flattened chests and like the big dicks, people in the audience are going to be like, I've seen this and I know what this means and I know what you're doing. When you then show these guys who think that they're all that and who are super hyper masculine and who are to be like, you know, a spectrum of different gender identities and to have weaknesses and vulnerabilities. I guess maybe sometimes if I talk about challenging stereotypes, that's what I mean. I mean, taking these stereotypes and breaking them apart and, I guess embodying them and then deconstructing them and working with what people recognise to try and to challenge what the expectations are about that.
Yeah, but there's a risk involved as well, like there is with any kind of performance. I guess we I did a night called A Queer Review, which is kind of like a cabaret and performance night, and this one was curated with two friends of mine, both identify as trans queer women, and on the night it was a great event. The numbers compared to a normal night that we would do reflected the fact, I think, that people thought that it was for trans people, and there was nothing at all to say that it was exclusively for trans people. But we had loads of different trans people from across Manchester, a lot of whom who didn't know each other, come to that event, and it was great. And there was a young queer couple, I don't know how they identified that. They came to me at the end and they said, why are there no trans male or trans masculine people represented on the lineup? First of all, there were, but it was not my place to point that out to them, because it's the place of the performance to do that. But it was interesting, A, that they hadn't recognised that, and B, that it had been a problem for them, and C, that they thought that it was our responsibility to give that to them, which I thought was quite interesting. So I had a nice conversation with them about, like, I'll tell you what our resources are. Our resources are this building, which they give to us, the cut of the door, so that's the money that we get, and whoever we can reach in time to stage the event. That's our resources for this event. And they were really interested in that because they thought that we were somehow very kind of powerful gatekeepers who had access to money and we were like, we're just winging it. But the fact that they were really invested in that I thought was really good and really interesting. And I said, well, come back with a performance, with an idea, with someone that you want to see, and we'll make that happen. But it was interested in how invested they were, and I think that's a peculiar responsibility of queer artists to represent
at all times.
To represent at all times, and also, and it's like relates to what I said before, where quite often people from outside the community will want me to speak for LG, B and T, and I'm like, you're going to have to ask someone else about that, and that's quite troublesome for them and a bit of a chore. And I'm like, well, do the work.
I mean, I just to come back on that, I do think that there is a responsibility for people who curate shows and who book artists and who are arranging platforms to do what they can to particularly represent people who are elsewhere not represented, people of colour, for example, disabled people. I think with like speaking as a trans-mas person about trans-masculinity, there's a kind of weird, as with many identity formations, like there's like privilege in some senses and disadvantage in other senses. I think, as you were already saying, there's a lot of interesting discussion and powerful stuff that's being said around how trans-masculinity is privileged within queer spaces. At the same time, trans-masculinity is like almost totally culturally invisible. As performers, we don't really get booked, or we do at a less frequent rate. There's a less of a knowledge about us, and there's less crossover of trans mass people into more mainstream gay spaces. So there's kind of, so on the one hand there's privilege, on the other hand there's like invisibility, and that's an interesting place to be in. My thoughts on that are quite developing, and I would be interested to talk to people if you have thoughts on it.
Can I just take a question from the middle there?
Yeah, I'm interested in the story you told about the art gallery, I think it was, and then they went and found someone who wasn't trans, and all of that. Unbelievable to me, but I guess. But my question is, I'm very interested in art, and when I go to see a painting or something, if it's an artist I'm not familiar with, I don't tend to think about how they identify in terms of sexuality. And if they were straight, like, no one ever asks a straight, oh, are you polyamorous, or are you, like, I don't understand why it is that trans people themselves feel the need to be so sort of out and say, oh, this is exactly how I am, who I am, and therefore come and see my art, therefore my art is relevant.
Yeah, I guess for me, like, all part of my identity informs my art, and so it's kind of impossible to disconnect the fact that I am trans from the products that I produce, and I think it's hard for people to understand what whatever it is that I'm doing without that knowledge. Okay. So that's kind of why I talk about it. But actually, the fact that I talk about being trans, and it's kind of a fraught thing for me, because as a trans activist as well, I'm constantly being asked to represent in some way, and to be the point of contact for people, to explain transness to cis people. So I kind of don't want to do that, but at the same time, I want to make a point of the importance of trans art and trans artists, especially when trans issues are often engaged with in the media or in art, and those narratives that are produced aren't produced by trans people. It's not our stories, it's not our lives, and therefore when I look at these stories and these things, I think these are not relevant to me. These are not relevant to the people I know. Actually, what this is a fabrication based upon someone else's idea of who we are. So this is why I always say, I need to bring the fact that I'm trans into the art and make that the case. I also talk about visibly being disabled, about being working class, and all of the other stuff in my work, and I think that's equally important.
Thank you. Do you want to
I think kind of just going off like the last point Jess made. I think the two things I would always say are, it is a pretty, as an artist, if your art is not reflecting your if your art is not being judged as a reflection of your situation as an artist, it probably reflects that your situation is quite normative and accepted, which is the first thing to say. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is, when it comes to why I want to push being trans in my art, it's like, I'm a 21 stone physically disabled tranny. I don't really get much of a choice normally if I'm read as trans and stuff. My art is something I can control, and for me it's kind of a process of going, a lot of how I'm viewed is out of my control, so I'm going to the one thing that I can control your viewership of. I am going to really kind of go in all these other spaces, you control how you view me as trans, you are going to be controlled in this. And I think for me, it kind of comes down to this feeling of my art gives me power, especially when I'm performing. I have power in that space. When I'm performing in drag, I have a phenomenal amount of power over an audience because I'm the centre thing, and I'm going to use that power to kind of go, this is how you will view me. It's being viewed as a trans person and a disabled person entirely on my terms.
I think I was going to make the first point that you just made. Like, if you can keep your identity out of it, then lucky you.
I meant it more in terms of, I feel like it's, why are we as a non-trans, like a greater society, whatever, why are we putting that pressure?
So why are trans people being pressured to disclose?
Or even to explain themselves.
I mean,
no one ever asks me.
Yeah, I think they might. I think trans artists in particular might not get heard otherwise.
Yeah.
Is the
It's
thing.
really
I'm like
Yeah,
already
it's very
out, you know,
interesting,
like it's
yeah.
not even in response to pressure necessarily explicitly. It's like, look at me, like you're either going to read me as a butch dyke or as like a trans mass person. It's like there's no choice in that.
Yeah. I mean, I feel
So,
like
you
a
know,
lot of
after,
artists
like,
are
the-
art in themselves, so
Yeah.
like they are their own,
Yeah.
which is great.
But it's one of those things I was thinking about, like when we've put in bids and kind of what as to put on shows and to get paid to do those shows, or at least not even to get paid, to get access to gallery space, and I've always felt this need to perform a particular type of transness for people, which is let me explain everything about my identity for you, explain like the process of how like I'm a, you know, of how painful it was to come to terms with my identity, and now that I'm on this magical, you know, whatever, and that's not my life. Like, it's not at all my life, and that the art that we've created have always kind of disrupted that kind of binary narrative. But as a result of that, no one wants to give us any money because we're not willing to share that part of ourselves. We're like, in a certain way, we've kind of made the choice to say we're not going to explain things for you. What you're going to do, we are going to take you on a journey. We are going to do interesting stuff, but we're going to challenge you. But we're not going to explain shit to you.
Which is the
I guess we're
privilege that
also-
other artists always have.
Yeah,
anyway.
exactly.
We're also sort of caught in a time, aren't we? Like we're caught in this like 2016 year of gender fluidity where like there is reception to a particular kind of way of disclosing identity, and there's a set of conversations happening that are ongoing and that are present, and that if you're an artist or a writer or, you know, if you're working with anything, it's quite tempting to tap into that and to be like, oh, well, here's my take on this thing that everyone's talking about. And I guess the worry is what happens when everyone decides they're not talking about that anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that's a bind that's happened, that's repeated itself way back for like the 70s, the first kind of gay liberation thing where you're invited to have that voice for the first time and then almost immediately you're asked to stop going on about it. I mean, that's the thing that like the most common casual homophobia that I always come into is like, why do you have to go on about it?
Just go on about being gay all the time.
Yeah, just like constantly. But it's like, well, you're the one that prefixes our books with gay fiction. You're the one that calls this a gay film when it's just a film. It's like, that's happening to us. And that's just an ongoing thing, and now trans people are kind of at the nexus of that experience. Have we got another question, and then we'll close? Yeah, thank you.
I was just thinking about, I've been thinking quite a lot about social dysphoria and how that is not recognised as much as part of what gender dysphoria is about, and it's maybe a problem of being an artist. It tends to like you become the centerpiece, so it's like the kind of social situation that creates you kind of is not maybe put under the spotlight as much as the actual subject, but like I wonder if there are ways of art of doing art that kind of turn that outwards and say, well, how can the artist kind of turn the mirror around and say, well, how are you creating our experiences of dysphoria?
Are you an artist? Okay.
I have loads of thoughts about this. Also, hey. I feel like as a writer, that's a lot easier to do. So I ran a series a couple of years ago about mental health called The Politics of Mental Health, and what I commissioned 10 pieces written by other people, and also wrote one. And the purpose of the series was to look at how social conditions create mental health conditions, and what the interplay is between, like, as you were saying, the person and the set of creating conditions. And it was really well received, and like a bunch of people were interested and they read it. And the problem is that even in order to start talking about that stuff, it's already complicated. Like it's so much easier to say, here I am, trans person with mental health conditions, look at me, here's me like as an artist doing stuff to my body, than it is to say, take a look at yourselves and everything else that's going on in the world. And it's kind of what you're saying when you say capitalism is going to be your PhD.
Yeah.
But it's harder, I think.
It's a really interesting, I find it really interesting that I'm, as well as being trans, I'm autistic. I'm also physically disabled, so I'm kind of great. If anybody wants a funding application, you can use me and I will get it. But I kind of, what I found with using drag as my art form is I get socially dysphoric more than I get physically dysphoric. And yet what I find really interesting are specifically drag and how I inhibit Marilyn as a drag character, because Marilyn is a character. I'm not, like, I use Marilyn as my name all the time, but Marilyn Misandry specifically is a character. She's a 50-year-old nana from Salford, specifically. But what I kind of find interesting is that because I am so much in the spotlight with drag, quite literally, like, I perform under a spotlight because I am really interested on centering myself in it. And what I kind of find really, really interesting with, especially drag, is how much I can use being the centre of attention to reflect onto other people with it. So I found, I spoke earlier about the Silence of the Lambs number, which is one of the most intimate numbers I do, where it is just a very small spotlight on me naked. And it is the most intimate number I do, and it's the only time I just have no dysphoria doing it. And what I find a lot is that when I centre myself in my art, because I'm centering myself in deliberately uncomfortable ways, it is immediate. There is no way of escaping the sense of myself in my art through the audience. So, you know, I feel like if I did my drag in a different way, it would be quite easy to kind of put the distance behind it. But when I'm so centred within my pieces, there is no way of escaping it. And I think it's it's been really interesting for me to kind of sit back and think, this in any other situation, being the centre of attention would make me dysphoric. And yet, when I'm inhibiting Marilyn as a character in his performance, because it's so not about me, and it is about their reaction, I can centre it. And it's a really interesting conversation I have with myself constantly.
Yeah.
I think I'd like to say two things to answer that kind of question, and I think, I guess, like, to go back to what you were saying about how trans or gay or queer artists are always like, oh, we really want to hear your story, and then you're like, why are you talking about it so much? Actually, the point is to kind of take that lens and look at, like, cis society and say, actually, no, you fucking talk about being cis all the time. You just don't realise it because it's the default, and you do all of these things, such as, you know, blue for boys and pink for girls, which, like, always is, from the get-go, policing gender in cis ways, and actually it's constant and overwhelming, and that is something which happens all the time and is you talking about that all the time, whereas we actually talk about it relatively little. And I guess on the issue of dysphoria, I am fortunate enough to live in a queer housing co-op and to basically only ever talk to queer people. And as a trans woman who hasn't, you know, decided to, or isn't at the point of wanting to pass or having the resources to pass as a woman, or, you know, undergo any sort of hormone therapy or anything like that, I find that I pass 100% of the time, because I'm not surrounded by dickheads who don't assume my gender, and it's that kind of process of turning that around, which I think is what you were talking about, and actually say what are the assumptions that you're making. So we did a show a couple of years ago called What It Means to Be Real, which I think is probably where we most accurately did that. So we kind of told stories about ourselves and about our embodiment, but kind of tried our best to kind of turn the mirror onto the audience and be like, what is it that, how is it that you're creating this? Like, this piece isn't us creating this. This is something that you are complicit in, and kind of trying to break that kind of fourth wall a bit. And I think that kind of reaching out into breaking the fourth wall has always been kind of a queer practice anyway, but like reaching out and kind of doing that, I think is quite useful, and I'd like to see more of that in queer art.
Yeah, I know that Jess. Oh, sorry, Karen. Yeah, I was just going to say, I know that your work and your creative groups, they happen in a space that's not nightclub focused. I mean, I think part of what the dilemma is that queer art is so, and our politics is so attached to nightlife and to bars. I mean, you know, it's the only political movement named after a bar, you know, Stonewall. But the way that our just those liminal spaces and how that relates to all kinds of things like sex work and anonymity and the city and all those things, we've necessarily been pushed into these areas for performance that are actually incredibly anxious spaces, especially if you, I mean, because I DJ as well, and if I was having a period of sobriety and was DJing in just a regular straight bar, and it's just too much. Like, they're constantly being touched apart from everything, and the machismo was just too much for me. I had to quit. The anxiety was just like, it's unbearable. And then you go and do a similar thing in queer spaces, and it's like, it's just different. But we've necessarily almost built these places that are just so intense, emotionally and sensorily intense, and so that turning it out is a really healthy step, but I don't know if I'm involved in that at all.
My thought was coming back to the social dysphoria and gender dysphoria as like sort of structural and individual things. It's a question of culpability and responsibility as well, right? Like, people don't want to accept their responsibility or their complicity in creating like a gender binary fascist world, right? They don't want to. People don't want to own up to how much cis people, mostly heterosexual people, but everybody really is like complicit and invested within maintaining this system of power relations in which there are these like cis straight people at the top, and then trans people get shut on in a variety of levels. And to own that as like a social lens takes a lot of work, because it means being like, I'm kind of benefiting from this and I'm in the wrong. And so it's much easier to turn things around and say, oh, look at there's these people with a condition. That's weird. Like, they've got a problem, those trans people, let's medicalise them. We can get them the treatment that they need to, you know, to be fixed. And to do work that turns that round is like challenging and destructive and hits right at the heart of how things are run in order to benefit a certain group of people. So yeah, it's...
And also relates to what Jess was saying about like the pressure on trans people to perform that narrative, even though it's a relatively new narrative, and say no, I'm not going to medicalise my identity for you, and I'm not even going to explain it. And I think the responsibility of the rest of the queer community who don't identify as trans is just to take that pressure off having to do trans 101 at the start of every conversation that you might have in or out of the community, because it's incredibly stressful and it's tiring individually for people to have to keep doing that. So we have to find a way to move that off people's responsibilities, really. I think if there's one more question, we're going to take it. And
so my question was about gentrification.
Yeah.
Because obviously I oppose gentrification, but there's also a lot of anti-gentrification critiques that make me feel kind of uncomfortable, because as I think was touched on, they often seem to be blaming like queer people and people who, whether or not they're queer, like want to try and create alternative spaces like cooperatives and art spaces and so on for gentrification. And also a lot of the anti-gentrification critiques I see seem to kind of be based in what I see as quite a conservative stereotype of what working class cultures and working class areas are like, of this sort of, you know, a real authentic working class area is where everyone who lives there was born and grew up there, and their parents and grandparents also lived there, and they're all within these quite narrow sort of anti-intellectual, quite, you know, heteronormative, cis-normative kind of working class cultural stereotypes. And, you know, that of course leaves those of us who are working class economically, but who, for whatever reason, because we're queer, because we're disabled, because we just want to live outside of these narrow stereotypes, like, kind of end up getting, you know, seen as not authentically working class. And, you know, those of us for whom, say, going to university is a bit of an escape from the shitty places we grew up. So I guess my question is, like, how do you oppose gentrification while still defending like freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom of identity, and not reifying these kind of quite conservative working class stereotypes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it relates to what we were saying about the difference between personal culpability and like actual municipal and developing decisions. Like, it's similar to that. Like, I and like most working class people you don't know that you're working class until you move away. And so it wasn't being working class that made me move away, it was living in Blackpool. It just makes you want to move away. So that dynamic is part of it, and as soon as you move away and you get an education, you become middle class. Now that's quite a difficult thing anyway, because you are stripped of a portion of your culture involuntarily, and also made responsible for certain things like gentrification. There's no people of colour on this panel, so I don't want to gloss over the fact that for the most part the people who are at the point of suffering gentrification are doing so because they're living in a neighbourhood that's predominantly people of colour. And so the whole complexity of diversity and what a kind of white elephant term that is also problematic, because these neighbours aren't necessarily diverse in the way that they might think, and they're still suffering gentrification and all of those things. When I came home from the Penny Arcade show the other night, which was all about gentrification, an estate agent had appeared across the road from my flat, like literally in the matter of hours, and the lights on it are so bright that we can read in our living room. And I was like, we've got like the last cheap flat on our whole street, and I was like, oh well, there you go, it's like, it's right there on your doorstep. But I think to anybody else, to see someone like me complain about the effects of gentrification would be, you know, it would be sort of vaguely implausible. On the other hand, I don't take any responsibility personally, because, you know, I'm up to my neck in debt. Like, where are my benefits of gentrification? It's that frustration to be accountable for something without any of the benefits, which is just you're too bad. I mean, that's part of it. But I think the solutions don't come from people like us. But yeah, the debate is really complicated, because necessarily it excludes you, because you don't get to make the decisions that actually impact on the city that you live in. Does anybody else want to talk about that? You're about to get a doctorate. Just quickly.
I agree with everything you said. I'd like to kind of pick up on something that you said, Steve, about how queer people are seen as middle class, and something that I've felt quite a lot. And now obviously I'm getting a PhD, so I'm emerging very clearly into the middle class, but I come from a very working class background, and I've often felt that up until this point I've been read as middle class because of my queerness and because of the way in which people read me as a feminine man, and that has a relationship to this kind of excessive this view of femininity in people who are assigned male at birth as being excessive and therefore middle class. So I've always kind of felt really uncomfortable about this, and kind of like people would view me as like where I live at home, like people would view me as an agent of gentrification, whereas actually I've lived there all my life and my family have lived there all my life and all this kind of stuff. So now I'm a PhD student and I study town planning, so I can very clearly pinpoint it isn't our fault. It is the planner's fault. And kind of one of the ways in which they do that is by hiding this kind of very political act by something so deadly boring as town planning. And so you get all of these very political decisions. So Manchester, for example, its kind of political kind of project in terms of making its city very marketable is to remove all of the people that it considers to be problems out of the city centre and out to East Manchester, where I live. And so they're kind of compulsory purchasing homeless hostels and kind of encouraging them to move out of the city. And all of these processes are happening, and they're doing it without realising that these are really political things, and kind of having these very kind of boring consultations in which people who actually come to them, and usually those people aren't the people affected by them, just because the language that they use, the kind of way it's advertised, innately turns you off if you're kind of a normal person. As somebody who is forced to go to these things, they are kind of, they're so dry that it's kind of like, it's like those people who say, oh, we're not political, we're making this completely apolitical, and you kind of know that there's something about this that you're protesting too much about it. There must be something political behind it. So they kind of make it really dry in order to kind of hide all of these decisions that are already being made by being pushed through. And so we really need to kind of point it at the planners and point it at the kind of situations that they're in. And it's not actually their fault, like in a lot of ways. Like planners are being sacked across the country for challenging the kind of neoliberal model, and funding to planners the planning departments are being cut. So definitely blame it at the Tories, but also at capitalism, which is shortly going to be my PhD.
Yeah.
So
I think we're going to finish
copyright
on your
Jess
PhD.
Bradley. Yeah, sorry about that. I rambled a bit. But.
No, not at all. I think that's a good place to finish. And on the point of gentrification and independent spaces, I'd like to thank everyone at Partisan for inviting us. And I'd like everyone, just encourage everyone to keep an eye on the project and support it whatever you can. I know there's a couple of fundraisers coming up, and it's important for us to have these kinds of spaces. And thank you all for coming and for listening, and thank you to Ray and to Jess and to Marilyn. Yeah, please do.
Self-promotion-y thing.
Yeah.
I edited a collection of essays, and it's in a book. And Kate suggested that I bring some. I didn't do it of my own accord, but like, if anybody wants to come and buy one, you can, and it can be like pay what you can. So just come and get one off me. There's a few. It's about young people's activist organising since 2010, and there's some really good essays in there.
Marilyn, will you do a plug too?
Yeah, I was just going to plug. I know I've talked a lot about drag and stuff. If you'd actually like to see some kind of cool pop culture drag nonsense that I'm really up to, from about 5 o'clock onwards over there, we will be having the first ever. We've looked at. We can actually call it this. We did enough research. We're having the first ever Simpsons themed disco in England. Which why no one's done this before? We can't decide if the fact that no one's done it before is a bad thing on their part or just evidence that someone should have really stepped in and stopped us by now. But from about 5 o'clock till 9 o'clock, we're going to be having like the best Simpsons themed party that Manchester's ever seen, purely because it's the only one. And I would really encourage people to come along and see it. We've got we had 4 drag queens at first. Now we've got 1. It's kind of like for example, we've got like an amazing drag queen called Monopoly Phonic, doing a number, and Monopoly's work is really amazing. She kind of does something similar to me. She looks at pop culture and stuff, and as well we've got prizes, we've got games, so come along at the end of this, because I know this kind of whole session's been quite taxing and there's been a lot of really difficult issues in it, so it's kind of like a nice way to unwind after it all. And as well, our playlist is ridiculous.
Jess, do you want to plug?
Yeah, please find us on Facebook at Queer of the Unknown, and you will be invited to experience Manchester's best. Can I say best? I'm going to say best. Best queer cultural project made by me. Also, a lot of the trans activism I do is through an organisation called Action for Trans Health. Do also like them on Facebook and on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Okay.